And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman. Dr. Pittman is an associate professor in the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. She's the Joff Hanauer Honors Professor in Western Civilization and has an appointment in the Department of Sociology. Dr. Pittman's book, Grandmothering While Black, a 21st Century Story of Love, Coercion, and Survival, explores the complex lives of Black grandmothers raising their grandchildren in skip generation households. Thank you so much, Dr. Pittman, for being with us tonight.
No, Ty, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. Okay. Slideshow. So I want to thank you, Ty, and the rest of the Adoption Network Cleveland team for organizing this important webinar series. I also want to note that at the outset, the data collected for my book took place in the 2000s, and I've stayed connected to this topic and population over the course of my career in a variety of ways. And so pictures that you're going to see throughout the presentation come from those relationships that I built, both when I was a National Science Foundation postdoc in Atlanta, and I sat on the board for a nonprofit organization, and in my time here working with a variety of organizations in Seattle, Washington. So the pictures are personal in that way and reflect that continued involvement. So the title of my book is Grandmothering While Black, a 21st Century Story of Love, Coercion, and Survival. And I want to also thank the numerous folks who have supported this work. So for those of you who don't know, I'm going to sort of zoom through some of the background information related to this phenomenon of grandparents raising grandchildren to get to sort of some of the meatier parts of why this book was so important. So in the US, children living with in a grandparent-headed household has increased from 3.2% in 1970 to 8.4% in 2019. The majority of these families are three-generation households where grandparent, parent, grandchild are present, and then 26% of them are skip-generation households, which are the focus of my work, which are households wherein the parent generation doesn't live in the home. And these numbers in no way reflect just how prominent grandparents are in the lives of grandchildren today. So some of the research by Amorum, Donovan, and Pokoskis from 2017 show us that nearly 30% of US children will live with their grandparent at some point, which is a pretty sizable number in terms of the child population in the US. 24.6% of these will live in three-generation households, and 5% of them will live in skip-generation households. So although African Americans are 13% of the US population, in 2019, they accounted for 20.2% of grandparent-headed households. And this is down from 24% in 2010 and 28% in 2000. They are more likely than other racial ethnic groups to be raising grandchildren in skip generation households, with the exception of American Indian, Alaska Native grandparents. So 1 in 10 Black kids will end up in a skip generation household, which is double the rate of the next highest group, which are Latino children at 5%. So it's, again, a pretty significant number. Why Black grandmothers? So my choice to study Black grandmothers versus other grandmothers from other racial and ethnic groups comes from a number of factors. So one is that Black grandmothers have the distinction of being more likely than all other grandparents to be raising a grandchild without a parent living in the home or a partner. And so I really wanted to capture what those experiences of this really unique population is. And then secondly, and I mentioned this before we started the webinar, the last two books that were written that centers the experiences of Black grandmothers raising grandchildren, one was written in the 1990s and one was written in the early 2000s. in no way reflects sort of the vastness of this experience, given the magnitude of both grandparents raising grandchildren, but also among this particular population. And so to be able to sort of capture the vastness of their experiences, but also the diversity within those experiences was really, really important to me. Make sure you can see that. Okay. And then sort of a second reason for really looking at this particular population was the real implications for what it means to deal with racial disproportionality and disparity in the child welfare system. African Americans are, along with American Indian, Alaska Native children, are overrepresented in the child welfare system. And to my knowledge, to this point, no book has not only not centered Black grandmothers' experiences in more recent times, but also centered the child welfare system as a really important part of what grandparent caregiving looks like today. And so I really wanted to sort of look at an experience of a group that was very much impacted by racial inequity in the child welfare system. And then lastly, and sort of connected to that, I think it's really important to understand how the complexity of 21st century caregiving arrangements has absolutely transformed grandparent caregiving for many grandparents today, raising their grandchildren. And because Black grandmothers are more likely to be doing this in specific kinds of ways, they can really give us a lot of insight into what this looks like compared to other groups. And, I think one of the things I want to say too before jumping into this slide is that these sort of disproportionalities that I'm talking about exist nationwide, but there are states where they are more pronounced than others. And Illinois has been one of those states where the vast majority of the children taken into child welfare system are Black children. That number decreased by the time I was collecting data, but it's still significantly high. At the time that, what was it? Um, in 2007, when I began data collection, Black children made up 61% of children in the child welfare system. And, I also want to point out that this is Ohio. We're looking, the adoption network of Cleveland, that these disproportionalities also exist in the state of Ohio, where Black children are 2.2 times more likely to be referred to children's services, 2.8 times more likely to have a report screened in for an investigation, and 3 times more likely to enter out of home care. And this is a report from the Ohio Children's Services Transformation Advisory Council. So for some of you, this is not new news, but for some of you, for others, it may be. And so these disproportionalities and disparities exist in many states. So also related to sort of why Black grandmothers experience some social and economic vulnerabilities that are really important to point out. So they tend to be younger. They tend to be more likely to live at or below the federal poverty level, to be raising grandchildren in inner city neighborhoods, to be raising more grandchildren, to be doing it for considerably longer periods of time. I already mentioned doing it alone, and to be doing it with impaired physical health. So I wanted to get at these experiences that I've mentioned around sort of what makes Black grandmothers' experiences unique. And the way that I did this was to interview and do some participant observation sessions with 74 grandmothers raising their grandchildren in skip generation households living on the south side of Chicago. The participant observation sessions took place in places where caregiving was prominent. So doctor's visits, welfare office appointments, school and daycare center meetings, appointments with caseworkers, and so on. The average age of the grandmothers in my study was 54. The age ranged from 38 to 83. They were raising an average of 1.81 grandchildren for an average of 5.25 years. They had an average of 3.36 children. 18 were married, 24 were divorced, 6 were in long-term partnerships, 4 were separated, 6 were widowed, the rest were single. The majority lived with household incomes of less than 20 women reported household incomes higher than 15,000, and the rest were impoverished, so less than 15,000. Of the 20 that reported household incomes higher than 15,000, 17 had incomes 1.5 times the federal poverty level, and 3 had an annual household incomes twice the federal poverty level. I'll also just say, for the purposes of this conversation, and I think, again, one thing that's really central to my book compared to others is that I actually oversampled for certain kinds of caregiving arrangements. So most of us know that the bulk of grandparent caregiving happens informally, meaning outside of the child welfare system. But I wanted to also really look at the experiences of women who were providing care inside of the child welfare system. So at the time of the interview, grandmothers provided care in 24 informal or private kinship care arrangements. 31 were legal guardians. 9 were kinship and foster care arrangements. 3 were subsidized guardians. 6 were kinship adoption, and 1 were private adoption caregivers. So that is what I'll say about data. So here are some of the vulnerabilities and challenges that these women experience, sort of in general, some of the social vulnerabilities they experience. So then it raises the question, given all of these various kinds of vulnerabilities that they experience, why would they raise a second, and in some cases, in my experience, third generation of children? And so I think the first place that I'd have to start in this conversation is that only love could do this, right? Like, at the very heart of it, these women and their partners, so grandfathers when they're present, um, do this out of love for their grandchildren. And so that love gets expressed in what it is that how they define what it means to be a grandmother. So that love is not just their caring labor, but it's that they want to prioritize their grandchildren, sometimes when they aren't being prioritized by parents and others. They want to protect them, both at times from parents and from the state, depending on whatever the dynamics are, from the larger world that, they know that they're going to send their grandchildren into. And then there's also the love that gets expressed by nurturing their grandchildren as part of their lineage. So many of the grandmothers talked about, I'm raising my grandchild because this child is a part of me. They're my blood. I'm raising them the way I would raise my child because this is my child's child. And so having that sort of lineage piece was really important and salient for some women. And then lastly, others really emphasized that love for them meant making sure that their grandchildren were equipped with the tools they needed to succeed. And so making sure that they had the education that they felt they deserved, the extracurricular activities, the spiritual foundation, the emotional and mental support. So those kinds of things. And so I think the love piece is really critical, because I'm going to get to the coercive piece in a minute. And so I think it's important to sort of preface this with love is at the foundation of how this decision gets made. Secondly, I would say that for these women, one of the things that I wanted to go in and look at was, what were their expectations for grandmotherhood? Because I think particularly with Black grandmothers, the assumption is just that this is what they want to do. They've been raising grandbabies for however many generations, and this is just a continuation of that experience. And so I wanted to look and say, well, what did you want for and expect for grandmotherhood? And many women talked about a concept that I coined a phrase for, called anticipatory responsibility. So in a sense, they anticipated having a sense of duty and obligation to their grandchildren's well-being and welfare, right? And so anticipatory responsibility could get expressed in a variety of ways. It could mean peripheral involvement, meaning I get my grandkid on the weekend or for the summers if they don't live close by, checking on the phone. Like, I know my mom does this, texting with some of their grandchildren. For others, it gets sort of ratcheted up to helping parents parent. I know that my grandmother played a huge role in my life in that way. My mom was a teenage mom. As soon as my mom got pregnant, she pretty much knew she was going to be helping my mother raise her children. Does not mean raising them necessarily, but helping raise. And for others, under certain circumstances, it meant raising their grandchildren for maybe a particular period of time while a parent finished school, while a parent in some cases was incarcerated. So there was some sort of endpoint in mind in being involved. So I think it's important to just note that anticipatory responsibility was something that was passed down, that women become socialized in. They see their grandmothers and women in their family doing it. And this socialization doesn't just happen as a child in somebody's own grandchildhood, right? You see what your grandmothers are doing and so on, but it happens across the life course, right? And so even if they didn't have that in their grandchildhood when they were kids, they may have experienced it when their mom stepped in and helped them, or when they saw other people's mothers step in and perform that role. And so this socialization sort of shapes what Black women kind of, how they relate to this role expectation around grandmothering as anticipatory responsibility. So one of the things that I found that is sort of related to this idea of anticipatory responsibility is this idea of what Madonna Harrington Meyer, professor at Syracuse, calls intensive grandmothering. And it's this assumption of responsibilities and aspects of child rearing that are typically associated with parenting. And so for a lot of the women that I was interviewing, the idea of anticipatory responsibility, the idea of intensive grandmothering was sort of their base. That was the normative expectation. And yet, I was interviewing so many women, as did Meredith Minkler and Kathleen Rowe and Dorothy Ruiz back in the 1990s and early 2000s. We all found this common theme of like, this was what I expected, but this is not what I'm experiencing. Like they were experiencing something else. And my book sort of centers that, right? I really wanted to get at, I felt like I was going to be really involved. And yet I'm still experiencing something far different than anything I ever thought I'd be doing with my own grandchildren. And so my book really gets at what this idea that I call coerced mothering. And so the idea of coercion and caregiving for feminist scholars of care work scholars is kind of not a new concept. I build on the work of this really amazing sociology professor, retired from UC Berkeley, Evelyn Nakano Glenn, who talks about coerced care. So coerced care happens when four things are present around caregiving. Your status obligation makes you the person that performs the bulk of that care work. So for grandparents, that grandparents are the primary safety net when children are in need of care in the United States. Across racial ethnic groups, grandparents are it, right? So status obligation, status, your role makes you the person obligated to do that care work. The second sort of attribute is a lack of alternatives or only negative ones. If I don't do this, it may not happen, which means I'm placing my grandchild at risk. The loss of aspects of identity and personhood. So once grandmothers assume this responsibility, it starts sort of eroding other aspects of who they are, which to me feeds the stereotype that this is all that they are and this is all that they want for themselves. So the last chapter of my book is called Managing the Burden and the Blessing. And I get at, what are these women's hopes and dreams for themselves beyond caregiving? What did they expect when they became empty nesters? What did they expect when they became elders? What did they want for themselves beyond caregiving? And it's a really rich chapter because it's just kind of, I almost feel like it's the heart of the book in a way. Like it's like, oh my goodness, this exists inside of them too. And so it's not just the loss of grandparenthood that they don't get to grandparent, but they now have to parent their children, but it's the loss of personhood and identity at times. And then it's difficult opting out. Once they assume these roles, because of the gravity of the social problems affecting parents, their children, Black families, Black communities, it's not easy to step out of the role because so many of these problems are systemic and structural, and they're not going to be solved overnight. So those four things are present. And then I argue that there are two additional coercive forces that grandparents have to deal with today. One is being compelled by the state to provide care or risk losing a grandchild to state custody, and also being at the sort of legal whims and marginalization relative to parents. And so coerced mothering occurs not only when grandmothers are compelled to provide care, but also when they must perform the social and legal functions of motherhood without the legal rights. Only parents and the state have legal rights to children, not grandparents. So we take for granted that when they step in to provide this care, they don't have legal authority to do it. And that has to get created, right? And at most, I argue, they have what I call quasi-legal rights, which are legal rights that they share with parents and that they share with the state. And those legal rights change depending on what kind of caregiving arrangement they have with their grandchildren. It is complex, which is why I talk about, a 21st century story, right? Like it's a very different story than the one that even a generation or two ago, their mothers and grandmothers were experiencing when they were helping raise grandchildren. So what makes contemporary grandmothers' experiences different from their historic counterparts? I argue that their experiences deviate in three ways that I think are important, particularly when so much of the sort of commonly held belief among Black and other communities, policymakers, practitioners, and academia is that contemporary grandparent caregiving among Black women is just a continuation of a historical experience. So it's different in three ways. Their grandchildren's circumstances have changed, including parents who refuse to relinquish custody of children for whom they may not be able to adequately care for. There is now an increased need to legalize one's relationship with one's grandchild. So we live in a very incredibly bureaucratic society. There was a time when you could go and take your grandbaby to the doctor or get him or her enrolled in school and not have to show proof of legal authority. That time is over. There are strategies that grandmothers use to get that work done without legal authority, but they still had to strategize around it. Like it's a thing. It has to be dealt with. So this lack of legal authority has to be dealt with. And then lastly, there's the very real threat, whether it's actual or symbolic, particularly for Black grandmothers and American Indian, Alaska Native grandparents, that their grandchildren will end up in the child welfare system. And this is important because for most of its history, the child welfare system excluded Black and American Indian, Alaska Native families from services. And now we're overrepresented in this system. And so that's something that grandmothers today are having to contend with that their foremothers did not. Let me look and see how I'm doing with time. Okay. So what are some of the reasons or some of the things that are contributing to these differences? I'm just going to skim through this because I want to get to some other parts of this. Some of the things that are contributing to these differences from historical to today are the support needs of the parent generation being incredibly different. So everything from unprecedented socio-demographic trends like more divorce, more single parents, longer lifespan, and so on, to social problems like mass incarceration. I don't think you can be American today and not think about drug epidemics and how they hit communities and families. Changes in social welfare policy. So welfare reform has significantly changed the nature of grandparent caregiving. So too has the war on drugs, which has led to mass incarceration, largely of Black and brown folks, and neoliberalism, where more responsibility is pushed back to families and away from the state. And then lastly, changes the child welfare system policies and practices. So not only were Black families and children denied services from the child welfare system for much of its history, and when they were given services, it was separate and inferior services, but also now kinship care has become in I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but in many states, the primary out-of-home service provided to children. So in some states, there are more kinship foster care providers than there are non-relative foster care providers. And so those are all big differences between sort of the historical experience and the contemporary one, and also one factors that are contributing to this increase in grandparents raising grandchildren today. So there's the sort of why Black grandmothers, there's the sort of what makes their experiences unique compared to other groups, compared to their historic counterparts. And then there's the question of how do they manage their caregiving responsibilities? So one of the things that I went into this work wanting to tell a story about Black women and resilience, and I won't give you the long story because I don't have enough time, and that's sort of how I ended up with this population. I will say though that once I started doing interviews with these women, I was like, this is what I'm going to be doing for my career. Like, I loved this population. One thing that I don't think I was prepared for was how incredibly complex it is. And so I went in thinking grandparent headed households and not distinguishing skip generation households from multi-generational households. They're so fundamentally different. And so with skip generation households, I wanted to really look at how do these women who don't have legal rights to the children in their care have to manage all these different aspects of what it means to raise children in the United States, particularly. So the first thing that they have to do is they have to create the structure to provide that care. And it's something that as parents don't have to think a whole lot about it. Like the structure is kind of built in, unless there's a divorce and then there's like, or custody issues, but it's a little more inherent. And for these families, it has to be created. And so there are a litany of caregiving arrangements that exist today that did not exist a couple of generations ago or even a generation ago. And so they have to make decisions about what is the best caregiving arrangement for their caregiving experience. And by caregiving arrangement, I mean this sort of like the way that it often gets broken up is formal versus informal, but there's a lot of nuance in those categories, right, of formal and informal. With informal, it's for most people, it's anything outside of the child welfare system. We're going to go with that, informal. But even within informal, there's private, no legal relationship, and legal guardianship, which has increased and is not being studied nearly enough. There's a really amazing scholar, Deidre Smith, a legal scholar, who talks about how it is the sort of informal child welfare system. So people are using legal guardianship in order to bring safety to their grandchildren or to navigate child rearing institutions without when they don't have the legal authority they need to do so. And so you've got the informal, and then within formal, there's a litany of caregiving arrangements, which I'll get to in a second. So they have to make these decisions about what's the best caregiving arrangement based on family dynamics. Is the parent in and out? Is the parent around? Are they just trying to finish a degree? Are they just working too much and they just need help for now? Are they just looking for housing? I know what the situation is. It's a finite amount of time. Let's just figure this out. Like, I can do the day-to-day care. You go get the kid enrolled in school. You take the kid to the doctor's office and so on. Based on the grandchild's circumstances. So is the grandkid okay? Or is their safety and welfare threatened? That's a whole different set of issues. If it is, then will the parent relinquish custody until they can get it together? If yes, they can go get legal guardianship, no problem. If not, now I've got to decide whether I want to involve the very system that I kind of don't want to be involved with, because it's the only one that's available to most families, the child welfare system, to prove that this parent is unfit and then become involved have a legal option around keeping my grandchild in my care. So the grandchild circumstances, whether they need legal authority, or want, in many cases, they don't want legal authority, by the way. Most don't want it. They get it because it's a means to an end, and that end being, what do I need to do to keep my grandchild in my care, keep him or her safe, and so on. And then, and I think this is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, individual desire. When I said most don't want it, not only do they feel like this is something that parents should, like they don't want to they don't want to usurp parental rights often. Like as much as Black women play this like parent like role in the lives of their grandchildren, they very much, the women that I've interviewed and continue to be around, they very much respect that this is this child's parent. I want my grandchild to have their parent, ideally. If that can't happen, then that's a different thing, but that's the starting point. And so individual desire based on wanting to keep their family structure the way that they envision it and want it, but also, again, back to that last chapter of the book, Managing the Blessing and the Burden, because there are other things I want to do. I don't want legal guardianship because guess what? I don't want to be doing this for very long. And if I get legal guardianship, maybe that's going to signal that I'm prepared to do this until the kid's 18 or whatever, and so on. So I think all of those things factor into making decisions about caregiving arrangements. What else do I want to say about that in my time? Let me think. So what I found that was really interesting around sort of making decisions about caregiving arrangements and creating the structure to provide this care is that with informal kinship care, grandmothers were making a decision between whether to, and this is using their language, take or keep their grandchildren. Taking often meant superseding parental rights or parents' rights, becoming legal guardians, involving the child welfare system, trying not to involve the child welfare system, in some cases, hiring their own lawyers if they could afford to do that, and becoming, getting some legal authority over their grandchildren. Taking often happened when keeping wasn't enough. Keeping is what we more think of as informal private arrangements that can be agreed upon. You leave the kid in my care, you go do whatever it is that you need to do to get yourself together and get your kid back. That's the informal part. We can leave it there. When that starts to break down, then grandparents have to ratchet up their involvement, and potentially their strategies for making sure that that child is safe. And again, going around parents in order to take their grandchildren. Other ways that they tried not to take grandchildren when they didn't, because again, it was kind of a last resort for many of the grandmothers, and everybody's sort of breaking point was different. There was a continuum of like what those experiences looked like, but they would try to become bureaucratic experts themselves to access the resources and services that they need. They would try to get parents to fulfill these sort of legal roles that children needed when they could. They would, in some cases, again, with great anguish, the ones who had to do this would then just go and prove that their child was unfit and become legal guardians in that way. And I think one of the things that's really important about this is that without these legal rights, grandmothers are forced to depend on others for authority, access, discretion, and consistency. Therefore, it creates this obstacle course of inconsistency and sometimes unattainability of the resources and services that they need to take care of their grandchildren. And lastly, I'll say it also created a lot of fear among grandmothers in this study and in other studies, that parents would come and reclaim grandchildren or children that they weren't able to provide for. In terms of creating the structure to provide care in the formal child welfare system, it looked like a completely different beast. And so for these women, it was having to manage what I call external state intervention. So state intervention in a family that was externally driven, meaning the grandmother wasn't the one that initiated it, but it was a mandatory or non-mandatory reporter. And what that often looked like was, instead of the very fear that maybe my grandchild could end up in the system, here was somebody calling to say this, in fact, either one had happened or two was about to happen if the grandmother didn't intervene. And so once the state got involved, there were two different options for grandparents. So there was either sort of the state mandated care of becoming a kinship foster parent. And then once they're a kinship foster parent, hoping that the parent can fulfill the various sets of tasks and responsibilities that they are assigned by the state to get the child back. So sometimes that happened and the kid ends up back in the care of the parent. If the parent doesn't do that in the allotted amount of time, then the grandparent becomes, in the state of Illinois, a subsidized guardian, or they can adopt. And many, don't want to adopt, so they become subsidized guardians, and some do adopt. And so there's like a whole set of options available once you provide care within the state. And then there's the use of what we call state mediated care, which are kinship diversion programs where the child isn't taken into state custody, but is diverted to the grandparent's home. Or the grandparent is supported in getting legal guardianship. And so again, very complex set of issues to manage when one is trying to create the structure to provide this care. And then lastly, I'll say around creating structure, there was the need to sort of manage one's child welfare system involvement. So these women have agency, right? Like they decide how they are going to relate to the child welfare system. And I identified 3 different strategies. So they either actively accommodated the state being present in the family, like they did this for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they agreed with the assessment made about the parent and what needed to happen. Sometimes they did it out of fear. Sometimes they did it out of not knowing any better about like what the options were. Some resisted, and some tried to maximize their involvement. And by maximize, I mean they use their child welfare system involvement in unintended ways. So for instance, they would use a kinship foster parent, kinship foster provider payment to help a mother get on her feet so that she could get her kid back, right? So maximize involvement. They tended to resist around a variety of things in terms of child welfare system involvement. Corporal punishment or physical discipline was probably one of the primary ones. Being told who could live in their household was another one. And then the degree to which a parent could participate was one. And so some felt like, how does this mother become a better parent if she isn't involved with her children? And so having to sort of navigate what that looked like or negotiate what that looked like with the state. Let's see how I'm doing for time. Okay. Woo! This goes fast. I'm just going to say it really does. Another thing that they have to do in order to manage their caregiving responsibilities is manage their economic vulnerability and acquire resources. So I'll just say that 63% of co-resident and primary caregivers are women. In 2019, skip generation households headed by grandmothers were 3 times more likely than those headed by both grandparents, and 7.5 times more likely than those headed by a grandfather who live in poverty. So if that gives you a sense of just how economically vulnerable, financially fragile these families are, I think that says plenty with respect to that. And yet, despite these high levels of poverty, research also shows that they significantly underutilize safety net programs, which are the programs that are available to the majority of caregivers who provide care outside of the child welfare system. So with only 12% receiving TANF assistance, 6% receiving TANF child-only payments, 17% receiving child care assistance, 15% receiving housing assistance, and fewer than half receiving SNAP. So that's really significant. And so it's kind of how based on all of this that they underutilize formal resources, and yet they have these high levels of economic vulnerability. How are they making it? The majority combine care work with paid work. 1.3 million custodial grandparents are still in the labor market, and they combine them, paid work and care work, by decreasing their work hours or increasing their work hours, depending on the circumstances, changing their occupation, altering their work schedules, and engaging in off the books work. And this is really significant for women who are already economically vulnerable. To make these sort of economic changes exacerbates that existing vulnerability. What also exacerbates it is caring for a non-school age child. This increased their chances of experiencing acute poverty because they had to deal with, like parents, the cost of work versus paying for childcare. Some of the issues that they had in terms of acquiring subsidized childcare were programmatic barriers and family barriers. Some of the programmatic barriers were things like fulfilling eligibility criteria. One grandmother said, "How do you expect me to work? How do you expect me to get a job when I need child care, get a job to get child care subsidy when um, I need childcare to get the job?" Because grandparents are often the ones that parents have care for kids when they're working. And so who do these women seek to help them with childcare became a real issue. Administrative barriers like delays, redundancy in paperwork, confusion over the process, and misinformation. They overcame these challenges by opting out of the labor market, by trying to fulfill the childcare eligibility requirement, having the parent get the subsidy even though the kid wasn't in the parent's care, relying on family, friend, and neighbor care, managing the economic strain of paying for childcare, and providing childcare through their employment. The majority couldn't get TANF assistance, the family TANF grant. Their earnings often exceeded the eligibility criteria. Family dynamics got in the way, like as in the parent was already getting benefits. They had difficulty meeting the eligibility criteria, or they were given misinformation about it. One of the things that was important for these women that I would say that they wouldn't have made it without their social support networks. They relied on their personal networks in a variety of ways, and largely by providing them with cash assistance by installments. So giving them a monthly set amount of money, taking care of specific needs like a bill, or bailing them out of financial crises. They also engaged in what I call maximizing their resources. So they prioritize the essentials. They strategize loss. So they got some utility cut off depending on whatever season it was, and kept one utility on that they needed. They paced their consumption of what they needed, bought different part things for the house at different as they could. They underpaid, meaning they looked for hookups, and they bargain shopped. I'm going to jump right into housing was an issue. We could talk about that more in the Q&A. I'll just jump right to the policy and programmatic implications, which are some of them from my research. I'll say that I think are really important are the importance of eliminating the gap between the kinds of resources and services that are provided to caregivers inside of and outside of the child welfare system is a really big one, and a lofty one, I know, but it's still one that I stand firm about. Investing in capacity building to help families systematically connect with what resources are available. So better connecting agencies so that if a family taps into one set of resources, we can then sort of connect them with other resources, I think is a really big one. I think importantly, because I didn't get to talk about the housing one, but I'll say providing training and education through both HUD and fair housing initiatives for frontline workers who misinterpret policies for these families, who often get told, for instance, that they need legal guardianship to keep their Section 8 or housing voucher, which is just not true. There are federal protections for these families. Expanding TANF goals to directly include grandparent-headed households, linking benefit systems, changing and clarifying eligibility criteria, providing subsidized childcare while these grandparents actually search for a job. And then lastly, coordinating and partnership between statewide aging networks and public agencies serving grandparent-headed households. And I'll just stop there. Stop the screen share.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. While you've been talking, I put a couple things in the chat, a couple links for your website and for your book so that we can, get to reading and, learning more about your work that you've been doing. I also put some links for support services Adoption Network Cleveland offers. And so that kinship care is part of our mission as an organization to support. There's a lot of overlap between adoption issues and kinship care issues, of course. Anyone who has questions, they can be put in the chat at this time, or if you want to go ahead and come off mute and ask that would be great.
Hi there, Dr. Pittman. Thank you for that presentation. I have so many questions, so I'm trying to narrow down what I want to ask. And I guess my first curiosity is, you spoke about why many grandparents don't want to adopt and they would rather opt for the subsidized guardianship. Could you speak a little bit more about what leads them to that choice?
Yeah, no, I think that's such a really great question. One of the things I'll say is I think there was this sort of like, almost will say it's a myth that these caregivers, black grandmothers, grandparents particularly, were sort of anti-adoption. And what we know now is that the bulk of adoption that's happening by grandparents is through the kinship foster care system. Right. And I'm not sure if that's just because there's just much more involvement in the formal child welfare system, but it's happening. And yet still most would prefer not to. And I think largely the idea of terminating parental rights it's I don't even want to say it's a last resort. I think unless that parent is not alive, most grandparents are just not comfortable terminating parental rights. Again, I think speaking to the cultural significance of this is still your mother, right? Like I remember one grandmother that I interviewed had just being really, really adamant about showing me the change of her grandchildren's birth certificates to her name. And she just felt she just was years later, she was completely uncomfortable with that. Her daughter's name was erased from the record with respect to her grandchildren. And I think you could go a lot of different places with that for African Americans, but the idea of terminating parental rights is something that I think, generally speaking, many grandparents are not comfortable with. I think they almost always want to leave the door open to, if in the final hour even, that parent gets themselves together and can raise his or her child, they should be able to do that. And it was interesting, like there was a grandmother that I talk about in my book who kind of went against that idea because she was just like, her daughter she had dealt with postpartum depression and she had gotten remarried. She was pregnant with her next child and she wanted her kid back. And that grandmother was like, I am connected now. We are bonded. And it went against so many of the other grandmothers that I was interviewing who were just like, no matter how much you love this child, like they should be with parents. And she was like, yeah, no, we're going to court. Like you're not, yeah. So I thought that was really interesting, but I actually point her out in my book as the anomaly. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to pose a question? If we can take a few more. There was a question that came through in the chat about in your interviews, what did the grandmothers you spoke with feel that they needed most from supportive organizations and for themselves?
Oh, wow. I think that's that's another really good question. You know, one of the things that I'll say that they needed, I think it sort of piggybacks on the question that JJ just asked, which is they wanted more resources for their children. Like, not the grandchildren, yes, them too, but they were like, if there was going to be family stability, they felt like they needed resources for parents that weren't just punitive or out of touch with what the needs of parents were. And so I thought that was something that was really um, more dominant than I expected it to be. I thought that I'd hear a lot more about what kids in their care needed, because yes, there were definitely um, I can't say enough good things about the importance of organizations like yours. In Chicago, it was things like Catholic Community Church charities, Metropolitan Family Services. I don't even want to start naming too many, because then I'm going to miss somebody and they're going to be like, oh, you know, but they played such a huge role for these families. Like, you know, from the programming for the grandparents, the programming for the children, the early childhood intervention or the early intervention programs, the kids who needed support within the home, the helping with IEPs, all of that stuff was so incredibly important. And I find that all these years later, they continue to be really important for these families. There was such a big difference between families who were connected to organizations, support groups, and those who were not. And so I feel like the programming has been right on in terms of what's needed. I think a lot of them would just say we just need more of it. And again, I think there was just that need for support for that middle generation. I think was something that I think is really fascinating and important.
There's a comment in the chat. I think that reluctance to adopt and therefore legally erase the birth parents is laudable and preserves generational continuity.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I could not agree with you more. It was, you know, I think about stories of some of the grandmothers who would correct their grandchildren when the kid would call the mom by their name. And they would say, that is your mother, you know, and the kid would be like, well, you aren't, yeah, both and, you know, I am, and she is too. I'm your grandmother and I'm your mother, but she is your mother too. And so, yeah, yeah, I appreciate that, Mary.
And putting some links in the chat as well for where to find the recording of this presentation and other Monday evening speaker series presentations. Also a place to register for upcoming Adoption Network Cleveland programs. I'm also going to put in the chat a survey real quick. And I'd ask that you all would take just a quick second to provide some feedback on the program, but then also on suggestions for what you'd like to see in the future as we begin program planning. So I wanted to go ahead and put that in there. We can do maybe one more question. Anyone else?
Hey, excuse me. Mine is more so a comment, but I just wanted to thank you for this work. Like, I'm gonna get your book, but my grandmother, she is an adoptive parent, and before she got into adoption, she started off with kinship care. And so there was a cousin of mine actually whose parent was dealing with some issues with substance use. And so she just kind of, I like that you use like take versus keep. And so she was, you know, kind of keeping him and taking care of him until his mother got back on her feet, and she did. But that's kind of how my grandmother got started in the journey. Then she began continuing fostering and then ended up adopting 3 children. So I'm interested in just learning more about your work and reading a book, because I think I would love to read it and then think of it in context of my grandmother and just her journey. So just thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the things I also want to say, Tashiana,
Yes,
I
perfect.
I love that name, by the way, um, is that one thing that's also like so complicated about this is that if a grandmom has 4 different kids, 2 different parents, or even of that 4 kids, maybe the same parent, they could have different legal relationships to every single one of those kids. And these caregiving arrangements change over the course of the relationship. So I gathered information about this is the kind of caregiving arrangement they had at the time of the interview, but I also did calculations on for each grandmother and each child, how many different care arrangements had they experienced over the life of providing care. And so you talk about becoming street level experts and bureaucrats themselves around understanding these care arrangements. And sometimes mostly through just experience, because they're not often explained really well. And they're also difficult to understand, frankly. I have a whole chart in my book that outlines like each of these type of care arrangements and the legal rights that the grandparent has, the legal right that the parents have, the eligibility criteria, the resources and services that are available. And it took a lot of work to like hammer down that to create that chart, because it is so complex um, and based on so many different factors. So thank you for that.
Again, the link for Dr. Pittman's book is in the chat. I encourage you to check out her website and her research, so we can all learn more about this topic. Excuse me, and the link for the survey is also in the chat. Following tonight's program, our Monday evening speaker series is taking a break for the summer. We will resume this programming in September. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. And thank you, Dr. Pittman, for sharing so much with us and for volunteering your time with us this evening. Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization serving individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. We're a membership organization, and we hope that you'll consider joining as a member. To find out more about our organization and to support our work, please visit our website at adoptionnetwork.org. And we hope to see you in some of our other programs in the future. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This was great. And I hope to hear from some of you. And I'm glad to be wrapping up your program for the spring. Take care.
Thank you so much.